figure they nominated me because I didn't do anything bad. You know, you don't put anything out, they can't knock you.
March 2014, in a quiet home in Brentwood, California, 86-year-old James Garner left the entire crew stunned when he softly said, "I've kept this inside me for too long," about him. No one understood who him was until Garner uttered a name that sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Randolph Scott, the man who taught me what loneliness really means. Just one short sentence, yet it struck like lightning through the memories of a vanished golden age. Randolph Scott had died in 1987, and whatever existed between the two men had long been treated as a forbidden secret buried under decades of silence. From that moment, questions about the past, about friendship, about silence itself began to resurface. James Garner, the quiet veteran from Oklahoma, and Randolph Scott, the classic Western gentleman, had once found each other somewhere between glory and solitude. Two men, two generations bound by a secret Hollywood never dared to speak of. And now, with the final spotlight fading, he finally chose to speak. Why did James Garner, who had kept silent for nearly half a century, decide to reveal that truth at the end of his life? Let's find out. James Garner was born in 1928 in Norman, a small town in the state of Oklahoma, where the red earth and dusty winds never seemed to rest. It was the era of the Great Depression, when poor families like the Garners struggled day by day just to survive the winter. His mother died early. His father worked as a painter, often leaving home to look for jobs everywhere. From a young age, Garner learned to endure and to be silent. He once wrote in his memoir, "When you have to grow up between the sound of hammers and the smell of paint, you will know what loneliness is." Perhaps from that very time, his eyes always carried an inexplicable sadness, the thing that audiences later called the Garner gaze. At 17, while America still echoed with the gunfire of World War II, Garner enlisted. The skinny youth from Oklahoma quickly became an honest, quiet soldier. He was wounded on the Korean front and was honorably discharged. Returning home, Garner was no longer a naive boy. War had left in him scars that could not be seen. Not knowing where to begin again, he left Oklahoma for Los Angeles, carrying exactly $40 in his pocket and an old suitcase. That city was always bright with lights, but it had no place for strangers. Garner did whatever work he could, from loading cargo parking cars to modeling for cheap advertisements. And then, as if by fate, during a small casting at Warner Brothers in 1954, his eyes came into the sight of director William Wellman. Wellman said, "You don't need to act. You just need to stand still. The audience will see your story in those eyes." From that moment, James Garner's life turned a new page. The former soldier from Oklahoma began to touch the glamorous but trap-filled world of Hollywood. And right there, he first heard the name Randolph Scott, the man directors called a model Western legend, a true gentleman. Garner did not yet know that this name would haunt him for the rest of his life. Randolph Scott was born nearly 3 decades before James Garner in 1898 in the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. If Garner was a child of dust and war, Scott was born in luxury, the son of a wealthy family educated at Georgia Tech, and once an officer in the First World War. But perhaps because of that background, he always carried with him a cold pride, something that made people both respect and feel curious about him. Scott entered Hollywood in the early 1930s, when Western films were still shot on real sand and with real gunfire. He was tall, with an angular face and a husky voice, the kind of man who just by stepping out of the smoke made audiences believe he was a real cowboy. For more than 2 decades, Randolph Scott became the embodiment of the ideal American man, strong, reserved, and always keeping his word both on screen and in real life. But beneath that calm exterior, Scott was an extremely private person. He stayed away from parties, rarely gave interviews, and almost no one knew about his personal life. There was a time when Hollywood tabloids rumored that he lived with actor Cary Grant in a villa in Santa Monica, a relationship that stirred public opinion, but Scott remained absolutely silent. He only said briefly in a rare moment, "People have the right to say whatever they want. I just need to live the way I think is right." By the early 1950s, Randolph Scott was already a legend, while James Garner was just a new face at Warner Brothers. Two people, two generations that seemed like they would never intersect. Yet Hollywood always has its own strange way of arranging things. One morning in early 1955 at the Warner lot in Burbank, California, Garner was standing in a corner backstage, nervously waiting to audition for a supporting role in a Western. The back door opened and Randolph Scott walked in. He was no longer young, but his posture remained straight, each measured step making the entire room seem to pause. Scott observed Garner for a moment and then said in a low voice, "You have the eyes of someone who has walked through a battlefield. Hollywood needs eyes like that." No one knew what that sentence would begin. But for James Garner, that moment felt like a call both gentle and fateful. From that moment between two men nearly 30 years apart, an invisible thread began to form, a connection that even they themselves could not explain. In the days that followed, Garner kept going back and forth to the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, a place full of dust, the smell of fake gunpowder and harsh lights. Every time Randolph Scott appeared, the atmosphere seemed to slow down. He walked unhurriedly, a coffee cup in hand, an old cowboy hat worn with age, but his gaze remained sharp, as if it could see right through the person before him. As for Garner, the young actor, both shy and curious, always tried to keep his distance, but could not take his eyes off that man. One afternoon, when the day's shoot ended, Scott came over, placed his hand on Garner's shoulder, and said softly, "Hollywood will not be easy on those who are sincere. But if you know when to be silent, it won't swallow you whole." Garner only nodded. He did not fully understand the meaning of the sentence, but the feeling in his heart was strange, both understood and warned. A few days later, Scott unexpectedly sent an invitation come to his house in Beverly Hills for dinner. That house stood apart on a hill so quiet you could hear the wind sweeping through the palms. There was no luxury, no guests, just two men, two glasses of whiskey, and stories of war cinema, and the loneliness of men who must live inside their own shells. Garner recalled that on that night Scott spoke more than he had ever imagined. He talked about the years of non-stop filming, about the pressure to maintain the image of a perfect gentleman, and even about things he couldn't share with anyone in this city. Garner didn't dare ask more. He simply listened in silence, but inside a deep empathy began to kindle. After that dinner, Garner often frequented Scott's house. They would talk for hours in the living room sometimes without saying anything at all, just sitting quietly gazing at the city lights beneath the hill. A man of experience and a man searching for himself both seemed to find in the other something that Hollywood could never give them peace. Between them gradually formed a strange bond, not father and son, yet not entirely friends. Garner once said he made me both admire and fear him, because with just one look, he could make me feel stripped bare before myself. And from there, what neither of them expected began a relationship that went beyond every mold of Hollywood at the time where fame is a mask and silence is the only way to survive. In the years that followed, amid the hectic rhythm of Hollywood, James Garner and Randolph Scott still kept the habit of meeting regularly. Every time Garner finished a scene at the Warner Brothers studio, he would drive his black Pontiac up the slope leading to Scott's villa on Rodeo Drive. That villa, hidden among old palms and dim yellow lights, was where two men who seemed to have nothing left to prove could talk all night about the things no one dared to speak aloud in the heart of the film capital. Scott would often pour Garner a glass of whiskey and put on a jazz record by Duke Ellington, the music they both loved. They talked about the past, about war, about roles, and about quiet fears. Garner was still young, still believed in glory, still dreamed of a fair Hollywood. Scott was different. He had lived long enough to understand that in this city, silence is the only thing that helps a person endure. But Hollywood never lets any secret rest. One morning in 1957, when Maverick, the television series that launched Garner to stardom, was airing nationwide, the magazine Confidential suddenly published a photo of him fishing in Malibu with Randolph Scott. Both were dressed simply smiling in the sun, an image that seemed harmless, but sent the tabloids into a frenzy. The big headline on the front page read, "Has Randolph Scott found a soulmate 3 decades younger?" From then on, rumors began spreading faster than a blockbuster. Some papers asserted that they often appeared together at private parties in the Hollywood Hills. A few columnists even hinted that between the two existed a bond beyond friendship. In the 1950s, the mere insinuation of that was enough to bury a career forever. Warner Brothers immediately intervened. One morning, Garner was called to a producer's office. The man behind the large wooden desk looked at him through thick glasses, his voice cold as steel. "Don't let off-screen relationships damage your reputation. In Hollywood, sometimes a single photo is enough to end an entire career." Garner did not answer. He only looked down at his hands, the hands that had once clasped Scott's during late-night conversations. When he left the office, the sunlight outside made him squint. For the first time, he clearly understood what it felt like to be touched by Hollywood, both chilling and exposing. That evening, he drove to Rodeo Drive. The villa lights were still on. Scott still sat on the porch pipe in hand as always. But this time, Garner did not step inside. He lingered before the gate for a long time, then turned the car around. No farewell was spoken, but both knew that silence was the final word. From that day on, they gradually drifted apart. Garner was busy with projects and a reputation rising like a kite in the wind, while Scott, like a fading shadow, withdrew from the world he had once dominated. Between them, there was no quarrel, no resentment, only a distance that grew longer and longer. The distance of two people who understood that sometimes to keep what is most precious, one has to lose each other. In 1962, Randolph Scott announced his retirement after completing Ride the High Country, the final film that closed out more than 3 decades as a Western icon. The press conference that day took place in Los Angeles under the harsh midday sun, and Scott said only one brief sentence: "It's time for others to continue the road I've walked for too long." After that, he packed his bags, left California, and returned to Charlotte, North Carolina, the hometown where he was born. The old red brick mansion on Queens Road became the place where he withdrew for the rest of his life. Scott married Patricia Stillman, a former model, who had appeared in a few magazines in the 1940s, but they hardly ever appeared together in public. He spent his time hunting, reading the Bible, and every morning walking around the garden, keeping completely away from Hollywood's noise. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, James Garner was stepping into the brightest period of his career. In 1963, he appeared in The Great Escape, the classic film that catapulted him to international movie stardom. By the mid-1970s, with the series The Rockford Files, Garner became the emblem of the American man who is calm and humorous, yet harbors emotional depth. Audiences loved him. Hollywood celebrated him. And yet, amid the praise, there was always a quiet emptiness in those eyes, an emptiness whose shape no one knew. Close friends say that Garner never mentioned Randolph Scott in any conversation, but in the old leather wallet he always carried, there was a small photograph of the two of them sitting on the porch of the Rodeo Drive house, a glass of whiskey set between them on a wooden table and Scott's half smile. No one knew why he kept that photo, but each time he saw it, Garner would simply smile and quietly put it away. In 1987, Randolph Scott passed away in Charlotte at the age of 89. The small funeral was held at First Presbyterian Church in the cool autumn of Carolina. Few of his old friends from the film industry were present, as most had either died or long left the spotlight. James Garner did not attend either. He stayed in Los Angeles, sitting alone by the window watching the rainfall. The next day, a wreath was sent to the funeral, along with a small note with no sender's name. On it was just one line scrawled in blue ink. "I still remember your gaze on that first day, the only one who ever truly saw through me." No one in the church knew who it was from. But Patricia Stillman Scott's wife, when she read the line, merely smiled faintly and whispered, "It must be from him." And somewhere between the two ends of the country, a man who had chosen silence for so long felt more than ever the emptiness in his heart, an emptiness that fame money or millions of stage lights could never fill. In the 2000s, James Garner was already in his 80s. Hollywood still bustled with young faces and new films while he chose to stand apart from it all. The house in Brentwood, California, once a gathering point for the press and friends, was now strangely quiet. Each morning he sat by the window, the early sunlight casting across a face marked with wrinkles, sometimes leafing through old photos among them, the one of two men sitting side by side under the Malibu sun. One looked into the lens, the other gazed far away. After a minor stroke in 2008, Garner began to limit public appearances. He refused many interview invitations, agreeing only to a few small conversations with close friends. In those rare talks, he seldom spoke of cinema. Instead, he mentioned the people who passed through my life and left marks that never fade. Once, when a reporter asked if you could speak about one person you truly respected, who would you choose? Garner fell silent for a long time, as if the question touched what he tried to forget. Finally, he replied softly, "The one I never dared speak about Randolph Scott." That remark was replayed on a small television program, surprising viewers. The name Randolph Scott, which had faded after more than half a century, suddenly rang out again in a new era, like an off-key note amid the modern clamor of Hollywood. But for Garner, it wasn't nostalgia. It was a summons from the past. In the years that followed, his health declined. Heart disease forced Garner to receive treatment at home. In his spare time, he wrote his memoir, The Garner Files. But strangely, not a single line in the entire book mentioned Randolph Scott. When asked why, he merely smiled and answered quietly, "Some things can only be said when people are no longer afraid." On sleepless nights, Garner often turned on the old projector and rewatched the films intertwined with his life. But among hundreds of roles, he lingered longest on a film that did not bear his name in the Cast Ride the High Country, 1962 Randolph Scott's final film. On the screen, Scott appeared as an old cowboy, eyes deep and sad, walking through the wilderness, quietly heading toward the horizon. Garner sat there staring as if conversing with someone who had left long ago. The older he grew, the less he spoke, but his eyes drifted farther and farther away. Friends said that sometimes Garner would still call Scott's name by mistake in his sleep, or mutter something about a promise not yet kept. And then, in early 2014, as his illness worsened, he agreed to a small interview at his home, the final conversation of his life. No one thought it would be the moment James Garner broke the silence he had kept for nearly half a century. In a room filled with dim light, the camera began to roll. and the seasoned man sat quietly for a few minutes before speaking. He didn't talk about fame or about films, but only about an old friend, the one who taught me the value of solitude. That story. The final truth James Garner was about to tell would render all of Hollywood silent, and no one expected it would not be a confession, but a farewell to the one he had never stopped remembering. The interview took place on a morning in March 2014 at Garner's small house in Brentwood, California. The air was slightly chilly. Sunlight slanted through the glass window, reflecting on a wall filled with old photos. On the table lay faded pictures, the Rockford Files, The Great Escape, and in a more hidden corner, the only photograph of him with Randolph Scott, the two sitting on the porch of Rodeo Drive in 1958. The crew included only 3 people, a young reporter, a cameraman, and a sound assistant. Everyone thought this would be a small interview about the career of a legend about to turn 86. But as soon as the camera switched on, the atmosphere in the room suddenly became unusually still. Garner sat in an old armchair, the light falling on his face, carving out every wrinkle of time. He smiled gently, a familiar, courteous smile, but his eyes did not smile. After a few routine questions, the reporter cautiously asked, "If there were one person in your life you feel most grateful for, who would that be?" Garner was silent. He didn't look at the lens. He only ran his hand lightly along the wooden tabletop. After a few seconds, he spoke slow, hoarse, but so clear that the whole room seemed to hold its breath. "Randolph Scott." A long pause. The cameraman glanced at the reporter. The sound assistant gripped the headphones, afraid to miss a single word. Garner looked up, his gaze distant, his voice tightening. "Randolph Scott is not just a legend. He's the one who taught me that. Sometimes loneliness is the price you pay to keep your reputation." He stopped, took a deep breath, as if each word pulled up a buried shard of the past. Then he went on, his voice softening but growing heavier. Hollywood back then didn't accept the truth. Those who weren't like the majority were pushed into the shadows. Scott lived and died in silence because of that. The camera kept running. No one in the room dared to speak. Outside the window, a dry leaf drifted down to the yard. The wind through the crack in the door sounded like a sigh. Garner reached for the water glass, but his hand trembled so much he couldn't hold it steady. He set the glass down, then lifted his head, eyes now moist. "I kept that inside me for too long. I once promised him I'd never speak of it. But now, perhaps it's time for people to know what kind of man he was." The reporter hesitantly asked again, "Are you talking about friendship or something more?" Garner smiled a sad smile, neither confirming nor denying. He answered softly, almost only loud enough for the mic to catch. "He was the only person who made me feel truly seen. There were no tears, no lament. Only a voice that had grown faint, releasing fragments of memory that for more than half a century he had never allowed anyone to touch." Then he leaned back in the chair, eyes on the ceiling, murmuring as if to himself, "Hollywood kills many things, dreams, truths, and sometimes even human kindness. I just want to give Scott back a truth he deserved." A small click sounded. The camera auto-stopped when the tape ran out. No one in the room said anything. The reporter simply sat there, not daring to look at Garner. Light from the window cast his shadow on the wall behind him, a solitary shape trembling between brightness and darkness. A few minutes later, Garner collected himself and smiled lightly as if to dispel the heavy air. He joked, "You know what's the funniest thing? I spent my life playing heroes. But in the end, what I remember most is the man who taught me how to be silent." The crew left the house when the day had turned to evening. In the yard, golden sunlight washed the house walls, while Garner remained seated, staring into the distance. As the door closed, the young reporter whispered to her colleague, "Do you feel like he just said goodbye?" The other replied softly, "No, I think it was a confession, but not to us." 4 months later, on July 19, 2014, James Garner passed away in that very house in Brentwood. When relatives sorted through his belongings, they found in the nightstand drawer a handwritten letter never sent. The lines were faint and scrawled, but still readable. "Randolph, I kept the promise for too long. Now I'm not afraid anymore. Thank you for seeing me when I hadn't yet seen myself." There was no recipient, no address. Just a letter more than half a century late, written in faded ink but honest to the core. That interview was never broadcast in full, partly because the Garner family wanted to keep it private, partly because they knew that that final truth was not meant for the press, but for a single person somewhere beyond the reach of this world. And so, like a closed circle, two people who had met in Hollywood's sunlight in 1955 now met again in memory, in final words, and in eternal silence. James Garner is gone, but his words still echo through the film capital. Sometimes to keep your reputation, you have to trade your soul. As for me, I just want to reclaim the part of my soul I left beside him. And somewhere, perhaps Randolph Scott has heard it too. Nearly a decade has passed, but that year's recording still sends shivers whenever it's mentioned. In the dim light of the frame, James Garner's husky voice resounds slow, heavy, and haunting. No one knows exactly what truth he was referring to, friendship, love, or simply the torment of two souls who once saw themselves in the same loneliness. Yet one thing is undeniable. Both James Garner and Randolph Scott lived in an era when silence was armor, a fence of protection, and also the prison that confined them. They loved their craft, loved the image Hollywood created, but that very world forced them to bury the truest part of themselves. "I think he forgave me," Garner once said in his final words, "because in the end, I spoke." That line rings like a confession light, yet deep, not only sent to someone who has passed, but also as if spoken to himself, a man who lived his entire life under bright lights while carrying a dark corner in his heart. Perhaps in that very moment, the two Western legends finally found rest, not as icons guarding an image, not as two people divided by prejudice and fear. Only the serenity of souls that found each other after more than half a century separated by time and silence. Today, as Hollywood has changed, as people can easily speak the things once deemed forbidden, their story still mirrors a past that's not easily forgiven. Because sometimes, to tell a truth, a person must wait an entire lifetime. And the question remains ringing out amid the studio lights that have gone dark, amid the wind whispering through the old streets of Beverly Hills. Will Hollywood ever be brave enough to face the truth James Garner spoke? Or will it choose silence as it has for centuries? And that was the story James Garner carried with him for half a century, one he only dared to speak of at the very end of his life. A truth neither loud nor dramatic, yet powerful enough to make all of Hollywood bow its head in silence. Because sometimes what haunts us most isn't what's been lost, but what was never said. And what about you? What do you think of the final truth James Garner left behind? Was it friendship, love, or simply a farewell from a lonely soul in a glittering world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you love heartfelt, genuine stories filled with the lingering echoes of Hollywood's legends, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journeys. Thank you for watching till the end. See you in the next video where we'll open another chapter of Hollywood where the lights have gone out. but the memories still shine forever.